Hello and welcome to the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast, where we discuss self-aware leadership with thinkers from around the globe. I'm your host, Nia Thomas, and join me as I talk to today's guest. I'm thrilled to introduce Rob Thomas today, who is a seasoned healthcare leader known for his exceptional track record across the charitable, private and public sectors. He's got a keen focus on people-centric leadership. Rob's career highlights include driving revenue and profit growth in highly regulated environments, and hopefully he'll talk to us a little bit more about that. His expertise in strategic leadership, stakeholder relationship development, and brand management has been pivotal in roles such as health system director, hospital director, and executive director. So join us as we explore Rob's insight on business development, operational analysis, and the individual lessons that he's learned along the journey. Rob, it's very nice to have you here.
Thank you very much. Lovely to be here.
Wonderful. And I will start by saying Dydd Gwyl Dewi hapus iawn. Now, for listeners and watchers, wherever you may be around the globe, today we are recording on St. David's Day, which is very important for us in Wales. And Rob is joining me from just to the west of Cardiff.
Yes, Caerdydd. I'm from Pen-y-bont, which is Bridgend in Welsh.
Indeed. So it's lovely to have an excuse to speak Welsh on the podcast. So tell us about your journey. You've had lots of different career roles and you've taken a winding path. Tell us a bit about your experiences.
Wow. So yes, it has been a long journey. Sort of a bit like The Hobbit, I guess. Started off many, many years ago when I was in the NHS and I got onto the NHS management training scheme. That was in Wales, which was a fantastic scheme.
Yeah, it still is.
Still is, yeah. And you do many things on that scheme, but one of the best things we did when we were trainees was a full 6 months cook's tour. And in the cook's tour, you literally work everywhere, from operating as a nurse and auxiliary on a ward, show my age using that term, through to being a theatre porter out with GPs in the community, etc. So that was a fantastic grounding. And I was mentored by, again, showing my age, a unit general manager in those days, just as chief executives were coming in. That initial training had a profound effect on me and my career. And I still, if I told you how many years ago that was, I think people would be surprised. But it's had a profound effect on me, and it's shaped me across my career. And I trade on those experiences now. So that's gone on. I worked in NHS roles in Wales and England. Then I left UK and I went to the Middle East. And that really opened my mind, working in Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, made many great friends there. Managing a hospital there, I was quite young doing that, just 29, 30. And I was all set to come back to the NHS in Wales to resume that career. And as if by accident, I ended up in the private healthcare sector. And I was approached by a role. I worked in Norfolk, lived near Sandringham. On the Queen's Estate for a while, managed a small private hospital there. Then I moved to a larger private hospital in Bath, and I stayed in the sector then for quite a number of years. I loved working in the private healthcare sector. I loved the freedoms it gave. But I did return to the NHS for 5 years, which was an interesting thing, coming back into a public sector setting, having worked in the commercial sector. And that's given some interesting reflections. And then towards the end of this, a terribly long story, I went back to university when I was the oldest kid in the class, I think.
Okay.
I did a postgrad in education. My sort of educational background was MBAs and that sort of stuff. I did a postgrad in education. That was the best program I ever did. Fantastic. A real eye-opener for me. And again, that has shaped my leadership approach since that. And that was only in the mid-2015, 2016, did that. Okay. And then finally, I worked for myself and ran a training business. So I wanted to prove to myself that I could sustain myself and a family with these skills I had apparently learned. And we did manage to keep our head above water for 6 years, but I was enticed to come back and work in the commercial healthcare sector, first in Bristol and now I work for a large UK charity, and I'll tell you what they are. They're Nuffield Health. They're a fantastic organisation to work in. And I've been in Nuffield Health for the last 5 years, but back in the sector for pushing 8 years after a 6-year gap. So I am again, back in hospital directorship mode again.
That really is a winding journey from the healthcare sector predominantly, but through different methods of delivery, I guess. How
Yes.
interesting. What are the main differences? And obvious, there are some obvious differences that I'm
Yes.
sure we will all know in terms
Yes.
of the private sector and the public sector in health. But are you seeing some other subtle differences that you weren't expecting to see across those two sectors?
Oh, absolutely. I think I love the NHS. It's tremendously close to my heart for obvious reasons, and still work closely with colleagues in it. I think the biggest reflection I had was, here you are. You are. Here's the keys to the private hospital. Your relationship with your corporate was quite prescribed, but quite light touch in a sense.
Ah,
And I think the big difference was you had to go and make your agenda. You had to go and make the running. You had to make things happen, as opposed to being trickle down policy or policy rain, is a term I've used. So that was a big difference, and it was quite disconcerting, but quite unusual for a previous public sector manager to work in that environment. So that was a bit mind opening. I think there are also issues about pace of execution. The commercial healthcare organizations tend to be smaller, so our span of control is shorter. But in general terms, the speed of execution from concept to delivery is generally a bit shorter, which is
mm,
terribly helpful for somebody as impatient as me. Okay,
yes, I can see.
really, really quite helpful. So those, I think, two key
Mm,
differences. But reality is there are masses of similarities as well. In terms of
absolutely.
the people part of the service are very similar, if not identical, really.
I guess people are people wherever you find them.
Absolutely.
Tell us about your thoughts on self-awareness. As you know, our podcast is interested in self-awareness and self-aware leadership.
Yeah.
How do you define self-awareness?
Okay. Health warning before I say any of this stuff is like many of us, I'm on a journey and I don't profess to be an expert or anything approaching perfection. So I'm an aspirant in all of this. But for me, being self aware is associated with conducting self aware practices. So I try to get to a state where I've got a quiet mind. I try to get to a position where I do listen to the internal voice, be mindful about our thoughts, our feelings. We, I'm sure you've talked about biases and our lenses on the world. Be aware of where we've got confirmation biases, and to get to that position where you reflect on those, to get to a position where you can be as neutral and as
Mm,
objective as you can in terms of leadership and decision making. And I think it's really important, particularly when you're approaching particularly sort of fast moving or turbulent situations, to be able to take that step back and reflect. What are the strengths and weaknesses here? What are the threats that are going on? Am I making assumptions about
mm.
about stuff? And it's very easy to act too quickly with limited data and make bad decisions. So for me, it's about coming back to those practices of trying to quiet the mind and try to be reflective. And I would repeat the fact that I am on a journey in that. But that's my mission, is to try and get to that position when I'm as objective as possible.
So, what do you actively do to ensure that the leaders who are around you are taking on those similar behaviors or ideas about finding that space to be self-aware?
I've thought about that a lot. And what I've come to the realization of is many people, either consciously or subconsciously, model behavior.
Mm,
Yeah, and I've seen that a lot, and that, in fact, shaped my own behavior. So I'm very conscious as a leader that in many ways we're establishing a tone in an organization of how
mhm,
we act and behave. And that tone and the culture that it converts to actually is very fragile.
mm.
So it's like pushing a really heavy rock up the hill, but it's easy to let it tumble down the other side very, very quickly. You can lose it. So I think I'm most mindful of how I behave. I'm most mindful of the the example that I'm setting, because it's contagious.
Yeah,
And being the difficult world we live in, good stuff, it's more difficult to spread good stuff than bad stuff.
yeah.
Okay, bad stuff spreads quicker, in my opinion. And then you layer across that your management processes and your practice about how you interact with individuals. And a lot of it comes down to good old-fashioned kitchen table discussions. Giving people the time and space to discuss things, trying to be in receive mode more than transmit
Mm.
mode. which used to be a fault when I was a young manager. But I think that tone issue and the models that we promote are really important.
Yeah.
I think human beings do model on other people's behavior. They see the tone, and that's what, particularly then when you link it to the issues around conformance, where I know you've got psychology colleagues in the audience, the power of conformance, particularly somebody who happens to be in a leadership or an influential position, are really powerful. So I have to think to be mindful about that.
Absolutely. And it was something that came out of my research in terms of behavior modeling. And there's a phrase that Sally Evans used in, I think it's podcast number 2, is that the shadows we create as leaders stretch far further than we imagine that they will. And I think you're right that modeling that behavior is very important. And I think if you drop your guard and you forget that you are being observed and that people are following your lead, I think that's a naive position and potentially a dangerous position.
Absolutely. And I've often been amazed how subtle it is as well. And particularly if you're like me, I'm sort of known for the throwaway one line, and you have to be so careful because this links into the issue about bringing your whole self to work. I come to work to try and self-actualize and be my whole self. You just got to be mindful. There are always boundaries. Although as leaders, I guess we spend our world living in a world of grey, But I think we need to be mindful of that.
Absolutely. So you talk about cultivating an environment that encourages people to bring their whole selves to work. How do you do that whilst ensuring that they are able to maintain those professional boundaries and not get themselves into trouble, I guess?
Yeah. All roads come back to, again, the tone issue and the leadership attributes that we sort of exemplify and show to our colleagues. I think that's key. So what do I aspire to be as a leader with my colleagues? And you notice my use of language is very particular. I really don't like the term my team, my staff. I always like the term my colleagues. So in no particular order, really, I try to act empathetically, understanding what people are about, understanding their views on the world. That's tremendously important. I think we've got to show capacity for being flexible with our colleagues. Lots of my colleagues have got lots going on in their lives. Flexible working arrangements, etc. Tremendously important. Celebrating success is tremendously important as well for me, and that cements the motivation that colleagues get. And providing the right sorts of support and resources. So in our business, we've got heavily professionalized business. Professional colleagues need to be able to do their continuous professional development and what have you. Plus the non-clinical staff as well are offered massive opportunities to grow themselves and develop. Good access to apprentice schemes, etc. Equality, diversity, and inclusivity are key. Being respectful and understanding of colleagues from different cultures, national backgrounds. Now that hit me like a sledgehammer when I worked in the Middle East. Clearly, I could probably write a book on that in terms of, I'd gone to the Middle East fresh out of the NHS, fresh off the general management training scheme. I always remember I hit this wall after about 6 weeks. It was in the days when memos would go out and emails would go out, and I realized nothing was happening, no change was happening, nothing was going on. I realized in that environment, it was all about the informal culture. In the Middle East, that the informal ways of doing things, where the power brokers were, you see it much more there than you do in the UK.
Oh, interesting.
And I had to learn the ropes very quickly. I could ramble about this for quite a long time, but my takeaway from that was, and I say to young managers coming into the system, it's about getting 3 things right, in my opinion, as a priority, and they get their pens out and they start writing it down. I say it's about relationships. Second thing is relationships, and third one, what do you think it is? It's about relationships and respect, and it's about our approach to the world. We got most organizations got a ton of policies and procedures, haven't they, that got for all this stuff. Do you live them? Do you do it? Do you do it in individual interactions? Do you walk the walk, as they say?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's the big question. And I guess that brings us back to behavior modeling, because if the values of your organization are inclusivity, but your behavior is to be exclusive, then as they say, culture eats strategy for breakfast.
love that one. Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. I love that one. Yeah.
You you've talked about, when you and I we've had a brief catch up before,
Yeah.
you've talked about flattening organizations
Yes.
and reducing the power gradient. It's interesting. I've
Yes.
just finished a book, and within that book it talks about power gradients, and it was really interesting. So what have you done specifically if you've been talking about dismantling hierarchies or flattening that power gradient?
I think it's what I'm quite passionate about,
Hmm.
and who knows, I might do a bit of research on this myself at some point to keep myself out of mischief. So,
Absolutely.
so core articles of faith now. So why do I believe hierarchies are bad? Fundamentally, for me, hierarchies will generate an environment which is less safe for colleagues and patients, customers, users, what have you. And one of the two industries which are quite aligned with this fantastic mutual learning is between the airline sector and healthcare. And I've done quite a lot of reading on this and some great examples which you shall I call them your listeners or your podders? What do I call
I
your
quite like podders. Maybe we'll
podders?
listeners and watchers. Maybe we'll call you podders in the
Oh,
future.
listeners and watchers because lotchers. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, listeners and watchers. Some interesting stuff. I'll give them a lead. There's a couple of videos worth watching. But I don't know if you remember, one of the Far Eastern Airlines had a tremendously bad accident rate 20 plus years ago. And it was fascinating. When you ask people about the accidents, and you ask them, who do you think was flying the plane? And most people will say, oh, it was obviously the inexperienced vice captain. And almost exclusively, it wasn't. It was the captain. And some really interesting stuff came out of a terribly tragic situation. So, for example, ice buildup on the wings, because people in the cockpit came from a very hierarchical society. They would use what is called a mitigated communication style in that hot situation. So, instead of you and I would say, Skipper, there's ice on the wings. We're in real problems. They would say things like, "Isn't it fascinating, Skipper, how quickly the ice builds up on the wings in planes when it's cold?" It's called a mitigated communication style because it's a product of hierarchy. And there were other examples where, "Isn't it fascinating how quickly we run out of fuel on these big birds? Isn't it fascinating, Skipper?" Crashes before it's the airfield. Ice causes the crash. So there was a huge cultural realignment program in that industry to adjust the communication style to make them more direct and instructive and particular the situation. So that really made a massive impact on me. So the link for your watchers or listeners is just another day. It's a tremendously powerful video. Airline pilot, his wife sadly came in to a hospital for a routine tonsillectomy. She needed intubation, which for your non-clinicians is to get an airway, making sure the airway is open for the patient. It was a difficult intubation. We had very senior consultants. One was a prof, surgeons trying to get the intubation kit in. I think it was a Filipino or a Far Eastern nurse in the theatre who knew that she needed a pediatric intubation set, a smaller piece of kit,
Mhm.
essentially, and didn't feel empowered to speak out, didn't feel empowered to push that issue, which probably would have made a huge impact. And the gentleman who was the husband runs this has done this fantastic series of lectures and videos about the need for safety in theatres, how simple things about like eliminating the power gradient in a theatre can have the most profound impact on safety. And one of the things I'm proud about in our hospitals, we have something called the World Health Organization checklist at start with
Mhm.
theatre. We've done human factors training in theatres, which majors on communication, majors on the fact that anybody can raise a flag and stop the line or raise safety concern. There's a leader, but nobody can close people out. And those are the major issues on safety that the sector that I've been involved in has made. So as a result of our incidents in theatres have dropped through the floor. That's happened across the
Okay.
NHS as well, and really, really, very, very proud of that. And a lot of it's work in progress. I've got a situation at the moment where I need to introduce human factors training because we've got the risks of culture getting in the way of safety.
Mhm.
So those are my examples. In any organisation I work in, I want a culture of disclosure. We know that the greatest learning we get about from safety is from near misses.
Mm.
Really important because incidents and errors often appear on somebody's dashboard.
Yeah.
And I've seen too many times, well, you get a culture disclosure going, people start to report things openly. We do the root cause analysis, get the learning. Oh, why on earth your incident rate's going up? All right. Why on earth are we getting that? So fortunately, the organization we're working now has a very open culture and encourages reporting. And in fact, will red flag somebody if they're not reporting. That looks
Yeah,
a bit
that's
low.
helpful.
So that hopefully there's some decent examples in there and also some decent resources for colleagues to look at, really.
Yeah. I'll make sure that there is a link in the show notes for you so that you can go and have a look at that video. It's interesting that you were saying that about pilots because the book that I was reading, so it's Leadership is Language by L. David Marquette. And towards the very end of the book, he talks about this power gradient. And
Right.
actually, there are far more aircraft crashes when the pilot is leading the plane or flying
Yeah.
the plane than there are when there are other people or
Yeah.
anybody else in that cockpit flying that plane. And I think that's quite frightening. I was involved in speak up programs when I worked in the NHS, and the NHS Civility and Respect
Yeah.
Toolkit was launched at the time. And there are some really helpful resources in there. If you listeners or watchers are in an organization that is highly regulated and you are worried about the culture and the safety in your organization, take a look at that toolkit. I'll put a link to that in the show notes for you too, because I think regardless of your sector, regardless of your organization, there is something that you can take away from that guide and it might just save somebody's life.
I would add to
So,
that, you can never do too much. Our organization now has introduced the freedom to speak up
yeah.
concept and just rolling it very assertively across the organization.
Yeah,
And
I'm
that's
a
great.
advocate. Yeah, most
Yeah.
definitely. So again, you may have recently been reading Stephen Shedletsky's book, who talks about the speak up culture. We have something very similar in healthcare organisations in the UK, where we give people the opportunity, and actively
Mm.
so, to speak up, to have an opportunity to speak to neutral parties within the organisation if they don't feel able to speak up to the individual who they have concerns about. So again, there is a lot for you to learn if this is something that's a concern for you and your organization. So tell us about your thoughts on embracing a growth
Oh,
mindset. You've talked a little bit about
yeah.
how you've learned a lot along the way in your career, but how do you instill that growth mindset in others?
Oh, that's a great question. Let's explore what the notion of a growth mindset is for
Mm.
me. It's the notion that our capacity and capability is not fixed. That as individuals, we have almost infinite levels of capacity to learn and develop. That's a fairly optimistic view of the world, which I was
Yeah,
immediately attracted to. That was cemented and upon for me with the notion of lifelong learning, which I got from my education, training. And I think that I never cease to be amazed at the journey my colleagues or team of people I work with or friends and relatives have in terms of their own personal development growth. Never cease to be amazed. And I played a lot. It might be hard to believe now. I played a lot of sport in my time, and sport used to be quite fixed. Oh, he's a third team player. He's a second team player, and you'll never. And when I've looked back and seen what people have done by application of training, focus, never cease to be amazed. So, how does that translate into my leadership practice? I'm forever getting into conversations with people saying, well, what are you going to do next then? Well,
right.
where are you going on your journey? Have you thought about this? What really appeals to you? And colleagues seem to really like that. And it is closely linked to the expectations we've had of people, drives their performance. And I've seen really clear, unequivocal evidence to support that. So that's the growth mindset for me. It's about continuous learning, about continuous improvement. We're not fixed. Errors like the instance we were talking about, there's always opportunities to learn. You've got to learn at the right time. You might have to get the issue sorted out, but you always have the post-mortem, if you like. It's not a great term, but you always have the wash up, the reflection on when there's been an incident. I keep saying to colleagues, we need to get into the business doing pre-mortems. The
Yeah,
Japanese, I think, used to call it failure mode analysis. What could possibly go wrong before we do it? negative brainstorming. That's for me is a kind of amalgam of issues which form the growth mindset approach to life. Very personal view, frankly.
What about your fixed mindsetters? How do you deal with that? Because I think being a fixed mindset and a growth mindset, they are two ends of the spectrum, and you can be quite a distance on one, quite a distance on the other. If you are a growth mindset and you have somebody who is very fixed within their practice, especially when we're talking about clinical practice, how do you help move them to nearer the middle?
With a variety of approaches, the default approach is to try to understand their view of the world, and let's be respectful about colleagues. Some people are very happy to have a fixed mindset. There's nothing wrong with that. So I wouldn't want to be judgmental. There's nothing wrong with somebody who's excellent doing X, Y, and Z, and they don't want to develop further. So that's quite important. And often, and this is one of the risks, I guess, of being very centric on a particular leadership model, is that we assume everybody's got the same view of the world as us. Okay, so there will be a cohort of colleagues who really will never shift, but they have to be brilliant at doing X, Y, and Z. The tactics I would use are around modeling, around trying to understand what the barriers to change are, understanding what their fears and emotions are. I quite often come across anxiety and fear. I don't like the uncertainty. I don't like the fact that I've got to try and process additional stuff in work, which I'm going to sleep at home and all that sort of stuff. So I really try and get under the skin and understand if it's movable. Try to explain the why of any change we want to make. I use the Kubler-Ross curve a lot. And the classic dip on the Kubler-Ross curve that people are going through change called I like the best description I've heard is called it the dark night of the innovator, the pit. Hanging on to the why we're trying to make a change or a shift is tremendously important for me. And I read a great book by Chip and Dan Heath, Switch, where they talk about human beings having a very strong emotional elephant, which you need to appeal to get to move. Trouble is, the elephant could move very strongly and unpredictably in the wrong direction. And they talk about having this really quite small rational rider that directs the way and all that sort of good stuff. It's a great read, Switch. It's been around a number of years. So there is no magic bullet. I think it's about being mindful, being respectful where people are, trying to explain what we're trying to do, what is the why. Then your stuff around modeling comes in. Then your stuff about trying to take them through the change management curve comes in, supporting, resourcing, people going up and back and down the Kubler-Ross curve and being respectful and mindful of that. But there's no magic bullet for this.
Yeah.
And ultimately, you can come back to that point I said near the start. Some people don't want to change. They won't change. And there's virtually always a role for those in organizations.
It's interesting. As you were talking, I was remembering that I worked with a clinical team. So I was developing integrated care pathways at the time, and it was about aligning practice so that we had a very clear pathway of the expected best practice. I was in intensive care unit at the time. There were nursing team colleagues who were very much on board, and there was one clinician who had a louder voice in that team than anybody, who didn't want to be working in this way. So I spent some time with that clinician, and I think you're right. It's about going back to the why. What he was very concerned about was, were we potentially reducing the likelihood that his patients were going to have the best care? So the more we talked about the principles of integrated care pathways and how we could bring that back to, the intention is, if we develop an integrated care pathway that has the best practice expected outcome for our patient, it helps us understand the deviations from that, and therefore we can reduce those deviations for those patients and make the care better. And he actually became a real advocate for integrated care pathways, and he was leading the charge by the time we'd finished that process. So I really do align with what you're talking about. Go back to the why.
Yeah, we've had to put electronic patient records into our hospitals, which you're giving up your handwritten notes and dictating stuff into a machine, getting is the end of the world as we know it for some colleagues. And very often as leaders, what we try and do is you'll focus on the fact that your biggest blocker can ultimately if they move, become your most evangelical change agent. So the stickers or the fixed mindset colleagues that you talk about are worth the effort. So are worth giving the diligence, because often in there you'll get your evangelist.
Yes, yeah, I
So it's
agree.
worth the pain, if you like, trying to make the shift, but recognize that some will never shift. Right.
Mm. Tell us about the Pygmalion effect. This is something you talk about. So
Ooh.
tell us what it is first, and then tell us why it's important to you.
So your listeners will know about Pygmalion, the stage show, which turned into Liza Doolittle, the film. I don't think it's called Liza Doolittle, but I can't remember what it's called now. Anyway, so Pygmalion effect rests on a very simple premise that our expectations of people directly influences their performance.
Hmm.
And quite good research, empirical research, supports this, and I see it in my leadership practice, if you like. So it goes back to the 60s. Rosenthal and his colleague took a bunch of students and completely randomly assigned them to academic boomers category. I think they used, regardless of their latent ability. And the clear evidence, and it's been repeated many times, showed that those in the high expectation boomers or bloomers group perform far better than students in the other groups, even though they may have had higher academic latency. And I think that experiment has tried to be adjusted over the years to avoid what I call contamination by intervention. And we see that in sport, for example, where we pick people who are great at a young age because of where they happen to be on an age spectrum within a school year, and they tend to do better. And the reality is they get a lot more resources and investment. So I think those sorts of contamination we try to be engineered out, and we still see the Pygmalion principle. So my approach to life using that principle is I tend to have really good expectation, trying to set the culture environment where people feel as if they can self-actualize and perform. And it's extremely impactful. So I often ask myself, Nia, as I wander into these organizations, this, product of a varied experience, why do people start to perform better? I don't put myself down as a rocket scientist. The feedback I get from colleagues is that we've got great expectations
Mm.
of ourselves, each other as a team, and it has a great impact. I've also seen the flip side of that. I'm sure you've seen organizations go into where there's a culture, there's an oppressive environment permeating the organization. And hey, guess what? That organization has to have really high complaints, safety incidents, whole 9 yards. So it's one of those where there's empirical evidence, and by God, it works. From my operation experience, your expectations we have of colleagues drives their performance and their feeling of self-worth, frankly.
Yeah,
And I think, what did somebody once say? People remember how you made them feel.
that's right.
I
Yeah,
think it's really
absolutely.
true.
Yeah.
Really
And
true.
you mentioned earlier praising people and acknowledging people for the good work that they do. I think
Yeah.
that is definitely a part of it as well. I
Yeah.
think that acknowledgement makes a huge difference. And you're right, the little actions that you do, it's almost subliminal in your behavior, which is why behavior modeling and your self-awareness has to be on 24/7 when you're a
Yeah.
leader. And none of us are perfect, as you say, we will dip and we will have a bad day,
Yeah.
but I think you have to have the awareness and the reflection to be able to go back and say, do you know what, I didn't do such a great day today, but actually I will do better tomorrow, because that impacts others, and others will then say, well, if he can do better and she can do better, well, so can I. And we all have that expectation of each other.
When we drop the ball is acknowledging that.
Yes,
So I found that's quite powerful, because I regularly drop a ball when I was playing rugby. But as a leader, we do drop balls. We're human beings, and so we didn't get that right. Is when you circle around back to a colleague and say, "I'm sorry about this. I just didn't come out right. I didn't." It's more impactful than getting it right first time. To be honest,
yes,
I'm not advocating messing it up to salvage it, but there is, there's something to that.
yeah,
Having
agree.
the openness to do that.
What about those people in senior leadership roles who
Mm,
don't do any of this? I'm sure you've seen quite a few
mm.
of those on your journey too. How have you seen them behaving? And do you have any stories that maybe
Ooh.
make toes curl?
Yeah, stories which I'm trying to neutralize in my own mind to make them sufficiently anonymous. So it's probably it's probably one of the most difficult things I find personally to handle, is when you're in a big organization, you see somebody acting and behaving in a way which is contrary to your core values. Something I've tried the hardest, and I've seen lots of examples. I saw one fairly recently where, not in this organization, another organization acted in quite a hierarchical way in terms of how they treated a colleague in a social setting. And I think I found that difficult to deal with. I suppose the follow-up question, what do you do, Rob, if you saw somebody acting in a way within your organization or outside it in a way which was causing problems? If it actually was causing problems, I'd confront and challenge in the nicest possible way. But that isn't always easy to do.
No, certainly.
Not easy to do, given the economic climate we're in. And it's easy to talk a good game, but hard to do on that. I think I've often found myself in the business of dealing with the aftermath of stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's probably, as a leader, one of the best things we can do is deal with the aftermath. But if it does cross a line of safety or dignity, we have to have a red line and challenge. And I remember once a great old colleague of mine, who was a close friend of mine, she was a chief exec in the NHS, who's no longer on this earth, once said to me, being a leader and chief exec, Rob, is about being courageous. So we have to have courage, but it ain't easy, given the impacts.
I'd agree.
Yeah.
Before we go,
Okay.
if you have somebody who's new to a leadership role and they're wanting to develop their self-awareness within their leadership, what kind of advice would you be giving them?
If you think on a personal level, I'd introduce them to the notion of mindfulness and the skills, techniques, and tools you can do for yourself. The reflective meditation. I love the 5 a.m. club, which I observed from a very great distance. I love the 5 a.m. club, 20 minutes meditation, 20 minutes reflecting, even physical exercise. So I would introduce them to the concept, the tools and techniques, and say to them that, and I do say to them, seek views which are contrary to your own. Seek view from the colleagues that you work with, the team that you work with. Do your 360. Be mindful. So those are the key messages I would give. And don't be afraid. A lot of the young managers will see it as a sign of weakness. I said, seeking feedback, guidance, vertically, horizontally, is the greatest sign of strength you could show as a leader, because that will support your leadership practice and the success or degree of failure that you're going to encounter going forward. So that would be my slightly rambly answer to that.
I think one of the things that I'll take away from our conversation is that just because we know what self-awareness is and we know how to be a self-aware leader, it does not mean it's easy, and you have to work at it every day, and it is an ongoing journey, and you will never get to the end of that self-awareness superhighway, but there is always a journey that has to be traveled, and you have to be mindful and on that journey to be able to travel it. Wonderful. Rob, it's been brilliant having the conversation with you. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining me on today's episode. Please remember to leave a rate and review on your favourite podcast platform, because a little word from you means a big deal to me. You can also sign up for my newsletter on my website, knowingselfknowingothers.co.uk. Join me next week when we discuss self-aware leadership with thinkers from around the globe to generate kinder, more respectful and creative working relationships through reflection, recognition and regulation. Looking forward to having you on my learning journey.